All right, so some people started to arrive, so welcome, folks, to Endgame Sensei. We have a special edition today where we are going to have two players from the Dojo training program in here to play against each other. This is Endgame sparring. This is one key component of the Dojo training program. And in fact, sparring itself is a pretty big piece of the current Dojo training programs, including both opening, middle game, and endgame sparring. So CartierTank and Falk, you guys probably all know them if you've been around the dojo for a while, because they have played in tons and tons of our weekend tournaments, and they've also appeared from time to time on stream. I've had CartierTank on for a couple lessons before. Falk has been on for a lesson or two. Falk was in Ultimate Sensei. Cartier has been a guest with the Scrubs. So these players have enrolled in the 1600 to 1700 FIDE training program band, although in chess.com ratings, they are in the 1800 to 1900 range, and I've seen Cartier over 1900. And you know, FIDE is tough. There's so many good players, and it's tough to climb to the top in the OTB FIDE rankings. So what you're going to be seeing today, folks, is one of the positions from the 1600 to 1700 cohort. They're going to play it with white and black. Then they are going to chat. I don't know if Falk, when you did the first position, I don't know if you did it correctly or not, but that's something that we can check in on today as well before we get into this position. Normally, you should play a game with white and black from a certain position against an opponent, and then talk to them about it and sort of openly tell them what you thought of your plan or their plan, etc., and they tell you the same, and then you could play another pair of games with them. But very important to have that check-in between pairs of games. It allows you both to improve your play a little bit faster, and the discussion, you know, helps both players' understandings. Also, because it's sparring with a view to playing it multiple times, you can try out moves that you think are interesting. You don't have to like find the solution the very first time you play it, right? So, for example, the position they're going to have here, you know, if somebody thinks that h4, h5 is an interesting looking idea for white, they don't need to sit there for 2 minutes on the first move figuring out if that is the exact answer to the position, right? You can just try it. You can play it in 10 seconds if you've got an interesting idea. By playing the game, you'll get some data on whether or not it's a good idea. So on the first couple moves, you can definitely just try something out, and then you can revise it. And that's another reason why you do that check-in after 2 games, right? Because that's a chance for your opponent to tell you, I think your h4, h5 plan was really dangerous. Or I think the h4, h5 plan was really silly, you know? And through that conversation, you'll get an idea faster about what you do or don't agree about, and what is worth trying again and what's not worth trying again, right? Like if you play h4, h5 and you lose the game, does that mean you give up on it, or you made a mistake later, right? And by talking together, you get to that a bit faster. Falk, when you did the first position, did you alternate white and black?
I only played the white side.
You only played the white side.
I might be wrong, and I played with black like once, but we never had time to do both. Like, okay. I mean, it still took like, I don't know, like 45 minutes or maybe to an hour to like do one side plus talk about it.
Okay. What time control did you use?
I mean, I did 5 plus 30, but it's 30. Like, it just
but you managed to play really so quickly. Long that you added.
I mean,
yeah.
I guess the talking about the part was the longest, right?
But, and some talking, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I strongly suggest getting in 2 games before talking, so you get to see both perspectives and both sides of it. Like, you may play a game as black and your opponent plays h4, h5, and you feel like it was hopeless. That plan is so good. What can you possibly do? And then you switch colors and you try that plan against your opponent and they have no trouble with it, you know? So it can be really revealing to see the other side of it. So I strongly suggest people try and get in white and black before talking. And I strongly suggest people do talk in between pairs of games. So I don't think you should play 10 games without talking. And I don't think you should play one game for 10 minutes and then spend an hour talking, right? We need to go back and forth between these activities, which will both be really good for you. Also, Falk, I think you should probably try to play the position about 8 times before you check it with a computer. 8 times total, like 4 with white, 4 with black, I think is about the guideline.
Yeah, I have to admit I was maybe just trying to check mark it off because it said win 3 times against someone within 200 points of your rating.
You met the win it 3 times goal.
So I met the...
You met the goal so you could check it off.
I met the goal and I could check it off.
Okay. So that happened because white was the stronger side and you played single games with white without having like the rematch with black. So you got to 3 wins.
Maybe it was also like the wording, I guess.
Yeah.
If we had a different instruction, it might have been different.
So I guess your opponent or opponents who played against you with black didn't get anywhere in terms of progress because they played black. So they didn't get anywhere towards checking off 3 wins for white.
3 times.
They just suffered and then like got no check marks.
Yes, yeah.
But in theory, if you're alternating white and black, the minimum number of games you could play to get to 3 wins with white would be 6, right? So that would be, pretty close to what I'm saying. So I don't think that's a problem that Jesse has that win 3 times thing. And also I would say if like inadvertently you hear some analysis or somebody tells you like, oh yeah, I tried that position. I know the best first move is King H1 or something like that. Mm-hmm. That doesn't ruin the exercise. I mean, sometimes the first move matters a bit. But even still, you could imagine we could go to anybody who's never practiced the position, tell them just what the first move is, and it's not going to help them that much, right? Like they're not suddenly going to play.
It's only confusing for the first position. Like knowing the first move, it doesn't help at all. And
they're not going to play 40 great moves in an endgame.
Yeah, exactly.
So the actual like moving the pieces around in circles, as you said, like several of the games you thought you won sort of just technically grinding, not because you played like a correct advantage in some way where they didn't have a chance. So, okay, so that's enough talk about that. If anybody in chat has questions about how to do the endgame sparring while we're doing this, feel free to add your questions here. But I'm going to get these 2 off so they can start racking up 30-second increments and getting some moves in. Cartier and Falk, you both comfortable? You've stared at the position for a couple minutes. You're okay for me to start it up?
Yeah, I'm good.
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Cool. Cartier, pick the number 1 or 2.
1.
Okay. You're going to be white, and this position is white to play. Okay? While you play, you should leave the audio, not just mute, but leave the audio from the Zoom call so you don't hear me talking while you play. But if you have any kind of problem, you can rejoin and talk to me. And one more reminder that if you don't make your first move within 1 minute, chess.com will cancel the game. So, don't stress over the first move. As I said, just anything that looks interesting, you can just try it.
Can we just hit rematch after the game or?
No, I will have to restart it for you.
Okay.
So how do we mute you?
Okay, to mute me, you see where you've got the little mute button in Zoom. Instead of clicking on that little mute microphone, there's a little caret arrow right next to it.
Yeah.
If you click on that arrow, the second from bottom option is usually something like leave computer audio.
Yeah.
And that way you won't hear or be heard.
Okay, I'm going to leave audio then.
While you play. All right, we're going to try and set them off. Oh, wait. He's still in audio, I think. Well, we'll start it, hopefully. All right, they're both out. They cannot hear. We can all hear. How's everybody doing? Great. Didn't think too long. Just tried something out. Moved a piece. Now, looking at this position, this is called by Jesse the Benko endgame. It's the pawn structure from the Benko. White has lost the b2 pawn, but black has advanced this pawn, so it's no longer a protected pawn, and it's blocking this bishop. The a pawn is an outside pawn, and I don't know for sure who's supposed to be better here or by how much better. But we'll find that out. We'll find that out today. Or we'll start to get a sense of that today. So Falk avoids a knight trade, and he may have in mind to post his knight on a3, where it would blockade White's a pawn at the starting line, so it just gets nowhere. Right? Give himself a nice advantage in terms of how far along those pawns are. Let me see if I can get this. Make that maybe a little bit nicer. Right on. All right, knight to b4 is the idea. He keeps moving the same knight. And it's not a very stable square because White can always play a3. So these knight moves might be a little bit costly because if you think about it, what is Falk's best placed piece? It's the knight. In fact, it's the only well-placed piece. All the others are trash, like utter trash. So his king could be improved, his knight could be improved, maybe even the bishop could be slightly improved, or maybe that's sort of the limit of its powers here. But it's odd to see him moving that piece repeatedly and still not clear that it's on a good square after all that work. You're welcome to chat away about this position in the chat. The players are just in chess.com. They're not in the chat window there. Stamen, you think that his knight was close to being trapped, huh? All right. The black pieces look more awkward than the white pieces to me at the moment. Technically speaking, this is White's bad bishop. But, I mean, it's got some diagonal and it's got a secondary diagonal. The knights, though, are really nicely placed for White. I guess Black's sort of fixing their knights, right? This can come here. Maybe it's not a big deal. Von Igelfeld saying both sides need to get to the queen side ASAP, and clarifying that means the kings, right? That means the kings. That's where the action is, these passed pawns. And in general, you always want your kings to fight your opponent's passed pawn or to help your own passed pawn. They're good at both of those tasks. So, yeah, the king should be racing. Here's the first step. Falk is kind of led that way by White's threat to take on e7. Has either player accomplished anything so far? I would say just a little bit. Falk's gotten this knight off the back rank and this king a little bit closer. White's gotten this knight to d4, which is a better square. I don't know if c6 is much better than d4 was. Okay, now he hits this knight b4 move, forcing a trade. So Cartier's simplifying a little bit. And after knight takes, pawn takes, he'll take away this nice square on c5 from the opponent's knight. But they're doing a lot of knight maneuvering, more knight maneuvering than bringing of kings so far. And my instinct would be that the strongest piece on this entire board, once it gets to the right area, is the king. It's worth more than a knight or a bishop in the endgame, once it gets close, for sure. It's a beast at close fighting. So they should be rushing those kings to fight over c4, d5, a3. Technically, this is Black's strongest pawn and their weakest pawn, right? It's their passed pawn, but also White could attack it. This is White's weakest pawn, and this is White's strongest pawn. The passed pawn and the center pawn that's a bit too far advanced, Black can sometimes encircle and attack it. So that's what we're seeing so far. Players each, not stressing too much over time, right? 5 minutes each. Falk retreats, not wanting to bring white's pawn to b4. And now potentially this pawn could be brought to d3. And if white's king were on e1, I would assume the pawn would be dead. I think Cartier is going to try taking it even here, and then hopefully rush the king to d2. It looks dangerous for black, but we'll see. Another move he can try here is bishop to f1. But I think after knight c5, it doesn't help him too much, so we'll see what he does. Right, this pawn's blockaded, and it'd be hard for black to break the blockade right now. It's on a dark square, so the bishop can't do it. A knight would have to do it from a4, b5, e4, or d5. Those are squares that black doesn't really control. So the black king would have to get in. You know, from the very beginning, there's probably a whole different plan for black, which is, this is a popular plan in the Banco, is you play f5 in order to bring your king to the e5 square. And the f5 pawn also cuts off the move e4 for white. It's basically a move designed to activate your king and isolate the e pawn, so that the d pawn, so that's technically a weak pawn. That'd be a whole different way to play this position. I'm just trying to think of where the black king could or should go in this game, right? And I mean, it could try to make its way into c5, b4. If you look at the position they have right now, even if this king got to the queen side, where does it get through? It's not obvious that it can make any progress on the queen side. Okay, so what happened? White brought the king before trading. I think trading would have been right, but we'll see. I just mentioned for anybody used to Endgame Sensei, obviously Jesse is the actual Endgame Sensei. I'm just the chump I am who usually stinks up the dojo. But in Jesse's absence, I'm taking over here, and hopefully I'll still be able to point out something of use to the viewers if they are even lower than I am level. So here we are. King e2 has been played. Now the knight is attacking f2. So what is Cartier's next move? Like, how is Cartier planning to make progress here? Not obvious, the progress, right? King d2, knight takes f2. Bishop f1 does nothing as long as the king's on e2. So what's white's plan to make progress? White could not move the a pawn because it'll hang the knight on b4. Bishop e4 or knight e4 are possible moves that may break the blockade of this pawn himself. And so Falk just grabs some space with h5. It does put pawns on light squares. I'm suspicious about that, right? White can play h4, lodge those pawns on light squares. I mean, I'd be more interested in either the central move f5 or the dark square grabbing move g5. So g5 makes a lot of sense to me as well. White can sort of play h4 at will. You can't stop white from doing that, but I don't see how this benefits Falk after h4. Maybe he's planning to play bishop g4 check while the king has to defend this, get white to play f3, and then just retreat and say that f3 is a really weakening move for white. The Falk has a low blitz rating, but you can see that his rapid rating is 1900. So it's showing his blitz rating, but in rapid chess, in classical chess, Falk is within 100 points of Cartier. So they're correctly matched. When doing this endgame sparring, it's important, or any of the sparrings in the dojo, it's fairly important that you play people within 200 points of you. They don't actually technically have to be in your cohort, although if they're in your cohort, they'll have the same positions as you. So they'll have an extra motivation to do the work with you. But they only need to be within 200 rating points of you for it to be a nice, a nice proper opponent where you've got good chances of winning or losing. Okay, bishop e4 is played. I don't know if he knows that he's leaving the h3 pawn under attack, but he's gunning for this. Now, there's some fancy tactics possible all of a sudden. Right? Some very fancy kind of stuff that could happen here. For example, knight c1 check has to be calculated because your pawn is hanging. Knight takes knight has to be calculated because your pawn is hanging. And bishop takes h3 has to be calculated because the pawn is hanging. So there's at least 3 moves that need to be calculated here. No, a fourth. Knight takes knight, pawn takes, knight takes, bishop takes must also be calculated. Now, if Cartier hangs the h-pawn, this h5 move is going to end up looking like a genius move because black's going to race with g5, h4 while defending against white's passed pawn. But this was still probably a mistake to put the pawn on h5. I think Cartier didn't realize he was hanging h3 when he played this move. So, knight c1, king d1. I don't see how that helps, but that's actually the choice that Falk makes. Let me show you one funny line just because it's the funniest, not because it's the best. Bishop takes, knight takes, pawn takes, bishop takes. And in this position, if you like knights better than bishops, you have this move. The problem with this is that at the end, white's better because they've got an outside passed pawn and you didn't win a pawn. But it was the funniest line. Probably correct is this line. Well, I don't know this fast. It's just a guess. But this is my first thought as to what would be correct here. Now, the point is that this pawn here is going to be annoying for the knight. Your king is within the box of the b pawn, so you can catch it with your king. And when your opponent goes king here to win this pawn, you've got 2 different techniques to harass them. Bishop f1 to try and hold it, or bishop g2 to win the pawn on d5. And that, I think, is going to be the best of it. So basically, imagine here, 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 bishop here. Right? Now white drops the d5 pawn, and black just wins the game. So that's kind of like a key idea here. And there's really nothing to do for white. It's just lost. You can go here and black can trade and play g5 and you lose the king and pawn ending as well. Very simply. So I think, like, to me, at first glance, that looks like the right choice. Devastating, likely losing for white. Black's plan is pretty simple. King this way, f6, g5, h4. And the fact that we can attack this pawn is just the extra juice we need to make sure that we win pretty easily. Knight c3, king here, knight just came right back. So inviting white to repeat, but of course white has better. White can now make the trade on black. Now, if Cartier's noticed the h-pawn is hanging and really wants to win, he could try h4. He can also play king d2 and wrap up this pawn. And after bishop takes h3, knight takes d3, it'll be close. He's noticed the h-pawn. That's good. I think he didn't see it at this point. This move was very bad. Falk spent the most time on it of any move yet this game. This move was very bad. It had nowhere to go other than come back. He may have been hoping for king d2, knight b3. The truth is that even people who are maybe very good at middle game tactics sometimes just don't know endgame tactics, and they just get like confused looking at what moves and squares are possible. I mean, for a player this level, it sounds like a joke to think like, oh, he's hoping for king d2, he missed king to d1. But I mean, what other explanation is there for this move and then And then after king d1, he thinks again and then just brings the knight back where it came from, giving white new choices when the pawn was hanging, right? So, you know, I think just a very, very bad calculation on knight c1 probably. And that is a little bit what you can expect in the endgame, honestly. f3. So he wants to win this pawn, but I think he's playing the moves in the wrong order. The thing is, once you play f3, black has the plan of bishop h3 to g2 for counterplay, with some chances of holding the game. So what you want to do is play the move you need to with the king first and then go for... But there's knight b3. King d2, knight b3, king d1, knight c5 equal. Okay, so this requires some really deep thought. They've got 5 minutes plus a 30-second increment, Mongoose. That's kind of like the time you would have at the end of a classical game. You'd have the 30-second increment, but you'd only have a few minutes left when you got this deep into the endgame. Okay, maybe f3 is right, maybe a4 is right. King d2 that I suggested definitely is not right. f3 was played. Yeah, I mean, I suppose if white marches the pawn, the black king's got to come, right? And then it's a question of how far do you want to march? Yeah, you can go knight c6. Now you can't move the pawn, and you're not threatening this. So, yeah. Not immediately obvious, but I do think, like, you know, a4, a5, at least like 2 moves of the pawn are reasonable. From a5, it's you make a barrier where the king can't approach. It needs to like respect you and come near, but you would be controlling all the approach squares. And then you could switch over to f3, e4, king d2 plan. So we get f3, f6, e4, bishop h3, king d2. Falk found bishop h3 to g2, so that's good skill. Good skill there. I suppose he could also try bishop f1 here. It's technically possible as well. I don't know for sure which one he found and which one he's going for. He goes for bishop f1. Okay. And these technical skills are all quite important, what you can or can't calculate when you get down to it. You know, this move here, knight takes, king takes, bishop takes, a4. It's not fast for black to make a passed pawn here, is it? But as long as the king can catch that pawn, you know, white might not have enough to win anywhere else on the board, right? As long as the king covers this pawn. Okay, bishop f1, a4, here comes. The first advance of the a pawn. It's not going to be an instant touchdown, but Falk does need to play king e8 to avoid that. Falk, what's your plan? Now the pawn is outside of your king's square. I mean, you're literally just letting somebody queen. I know it would be more obvious without the minor pieces on the board in a pure king and pawn ending. It would be more obvious, but I mean, isn't that the end? Oh, he's going to play knight b3. Oh no, and white blunders it. Oh my goodness. It was a trap. It looked absolutely terrible that he wasn't moving his king. 100% he should have been bringing his king nearer the pawn. I can't believe that he wins off of this terrible, terrible move. That's just crazy. That's just completely crazy. He goaded the opponent into, I'm just completely blundering. Oh, wait. Or who's blundering who? Now Falk is shaking his head. We didn't see this coming either. Notice how we're not even calculating one move ahead accurately. Are you guys noticing that? Like the players or me? There's like multiple multiple cases of not looking one move ahead correctly. It's just completely different and tricky in the endgame. You know, completely different. Now, bishop h3, a6, bishop c8, and if a7, you have bishop b7. Technically, you haven't lost yet, but it's coming. It's coming. I am. Yeah. On pawn d2, the knight seems to cover promotion, and white can take the bishop, I think. I don't even know who's calculated what here. So half of what I said was wrong and half of it was right, or something like that, right? I did say at first in this position that, like, absolutely you need to have your king in the square of this pawn. It's like, I couldn't believe he was considering anything other than just running. And then he played this crazy move g5 and let the pawn go, and we realized, like, oh, there's this trick or whatever. But even with the trick, it was terrible. Even with the trick. Man, oh man. All right, Falk. Play bishop h3 to make the game longer for us. Bishop h3, g4 is insane, right? That would be fun. That wouldn't... I don't know if that would be any good. But that would be fun to calculate, right? We can try and calculate bishop h3, g4. Why play for tricks unless you calculate? Yeah. Von Igelfeld seems more prepared than I to take on Jesse's role here. Did Cartier see the trap or get lucky? No idea, Nordvik. Let's see. Let's see if we can tell from the time usage. A5, knight b3 check. He played king e1 in 18 seconds. I think he may have planned for it, actually, Cartier. That's... If so, that's impressive. Bishop h3, g4. d2 check. King to d1. No, bishop h3, g4, knight a5. What am I talking about? Kvatch. Complete kvatch. On bishop h3, you have to play a6, I guess. The pawn's attacked. Bishop h3, a6, bishop c8. And then the game goes on. If Falk doesn't flag here. Gives up the piece, okay. That's going to be a GG. You want to see, Evan, if there was any hope in bishop h3? First of all, my first instinct here for white is not even to play a7, but to do something like knight a4, knight b6, something like that. But maybe knight a4, knight c5 would hold or mess things up, right? So here, you're saying this move to come here, right? Is there any way not to lose a piece now? Seems like no, right? Yeah. Yeah. So that would still win for white, huh? No, I think this is cleaner than my idea. Because my move knight a4, there's knight c5. Threatening the pawn and the knight. So you can't play knight b6 because takes. Knight takes, pawn takes, doesn't feel great. All right, game one is over after king e2. He's resigned. We'll start the next one.
Oh, we start again?
Okay. Yep. Have fun. All right. So what happened that game? Well, first, Cartier hung the pawn on h3. The tactics were a bit tricky, and Falk missed the way to do it. Then Cartier pushed the a-pawn, and Falk just didn't respect it properly. It takes several games before you can start playing an endgame that's both strategically and tactically sound, right? You need to feel your way around what some of the little tactical opportunities are for both sides. That plays into what you know about the position. I mean, you learn strategy, but you also learn some tactics, right? Some tactics that are more or less likely to come up in certain endgames. So... Okay, Cartier immediately improves the badly placed knight. I recall Falk starting with about 3 moves of this knight. Of course, Cartier had attacked Falk's knight, so that was an extra reason for Falk to move it. But, I mean, that meant you have to move it once, not necessarily 3 times. All right, so Falk starts off by improving the knight on h2 and doesn't look at the trade. Even though when he had black and knight f3 was played, he moved away as if he were afraid of the trade. Now as white, he doesn't go for the trade. I don't like this maneuver as much as knight f3. You block this pawn, so that stops bishop f1. I don't know where this piece is going. And also, let's just bring the king next, I guess, but I don't see where knight e3 is going. Without bishop f1, you're not really pressuring c4 that heavily. King f8. Look at that, Cartier taking his time to improve the king. What do you know? What do you know? Looks good to me. I would expect something similar from white. Let's see if the kings just wander over today. No, Falk likes pushing the h-pawn. Remember, with black, he also played h5 last game. And then he played like f6 and g5. He really wanted to grab that space and point towards a possible outside pass pawn. But also last game, I mean, he lost because he wouldn't move his king. That's a part of it. I mean, it's miscalculating, but it's also not moving your king. So if he doesn't move his king again here, maybe Cartier can point something out to him, sort of more general, in their discussion after a pair of games. Right? Like, I noticed you don't move your king in the endgame. Right? Because you can tell somebody, like, I think you should have pushed this pawn sooner, or I think you shouldn't have pushed this pawn. But you can also say something like really general, like, I noticed that you always put your pawns on dark squares, or I noticed you always put your pawns on light squares, or I noticed you never move your king. And that might be useful to your opponent as well. Yeah, h4 is better than h5 was because the pawns are now on dark squares for his light squared bishop. So it's more favorable, but I can't help but noticing the pattern there. I wonder if he's pushing the h-pawn for the wrong reasons since he did it in both games. Yeah, I don't know what about h4 is making Cartier go into a long think. Maybe he's mildly worried about h5 from white, or he's taking account of bishop h3 and whether that does anything. But But, I mean, I would play king e8, king d8, king c7 quickly here if that were my plan. Maybe he's afraid if he does it like too quickly and obviously Falk's going to get the idea. But he did it last game, right? He brought his king as white to d2 to attack the pawn on d3. And Falk didn't bring his king to defend the a pawn. So maybe now he can bring his king to support this pawn and Falk won't. We'll see. If so, Falk will be playing this endgame at king odds, which is brutal, brutal odds. You know, I couldn't win any endgame at king odds against anybody. Now, when they have their conversation between pairs of games, then obviously you need to tell your opponent everything that you thought and knew in those first two games. Like, you're not holding back any secrets about whether or not you want to bring your king in. You would tell them, like, I think I won because you didn't move your king. And then your opponent would either be like, oh my goodness, wow. Or they might disagree, and then you can talk about it. How are we doing here on this episode of Endgame Sensei without Jesse Cry? Now Falk in the tank. I mean, you know, some moves are just like, it's so nice when some moves are natural for you, right? If it's just like a little bit easier. It feels like laboring like crazy to play moves that would be really like, you know, 5-second moves. And he grabs more space. He's just obsessed with taking the space, huh? He is really... He's madly in love with space. Space, the only frontier for Falk. He takes away one square from the Black Knight. But every time you move a pawn, you make more squares for the opponent's pieces too, you know? I mean, the knight can find other places to live. And honestly, if the knight ever came to e5, you could have then played f4. Part of why it wasn't that good a square for the knight yet. Standing and yelling. Oh. Cartier's really like thinking deeply about his moves too. I mean, there are only 4 moves into this game, folks. Cartier spent a minute on king f8 and 2 minutes on king e8. And now a minute and a half on not playing king to d8. So he fights back. He grabs some space himself, takes a square away from these white pieces. This bishop on g2 is really quite buried now. Can white play g4 here? Probably. And he does. And he does. He wants it all the space. No, but I mean, this may have been necessary now to unbury this piece. But I can't help but thinking that you could achieve better goals just by bringing the king out. Like, something would work out eventually for your piece. I think you got it. You got to work on the king. Trade. That's a surprise. I thought he would support that square. Maybe he's going to try and win the h4 pawn with knight to f5. Maybe that's what he's got on his mind. Was knight d1 to b2 good to pressure c4? Absolutely, David. Yeah, that would unblock some of white's pieces as well. That seems interesting. So the idea would be knight d1, king here, knight b2, king here, and then bishop f1, right? It's a reasonable plan. Absolutely reasonable, right? it unblocks the pawn and the bishop can come. The only question is, you know, does your opponent's king coming out first give you any problems here, right? Because look at the white king that can't get into the game. We could even maybe like try and draw by perpetual here. Force white to play king h1 if they want to keep playing. Anyway, now we play king c5. Now, my guess would be that black's doing great here, David. And I mean, admittedly, I haven't calculated this position yet. There may be some analysis to do. But this particular version, my guess is that this king is better than any of the other pieces that are fighting. So my guess is that white would be in trouble here. Black's just going to play king b4, you know? You can play a3 to try and hold out, but then knight c2, right? It's very unlikely that you can win this fight down a king. And if we didn't have knight c2, we might have knight to b6, followed by taking this pawn. So it's just the scenario where white's going to win this fight without the king is very rare. So I would guess that you should bring your king to d2 for white first to cover this area. And then you could think about your plan with knight d1, knight b2, pawn e3, bishop f1. Something like that will definitely be one of the main ideas white could try. But I think if we only do that and leave the king on g1, probably black's got the upper hand. I mean, maybe I missed some tactic for white, but at the general principle level, black should be really good there with the king coming. Okay, so here, and knight c5 was played. Okay, I thought the idea was going to be knight f5, going after this to try and win a pawn. I don't know that that's a bad idea, but we get knight c5, and of course, you know, the passed pawns are the most obvious focus. I mean, if white's just hanging a pawn, maybe you should take it, but I'm never going to fault somebody for, you know, playing king d7 and, you know, moving the pieces towards the passed pawns that are on the board, right? Knight h6, however, I am going to fault somebody for. I mean, Falk, what on earth is your knight searching for over here, right? What? Where are you headed and what do you want? Now we see Cartier trying to break the blockade. And so far, I'm quite disappointed with Falk's endgame play. It's a little bit of a revelation as well. Like I can see how bad people are at the endgame finally, I guess. Maybe this is normal. Is this normal or is something wrong with Falk? Is this just average for an 1800 player? Because, I mean, I just don't know where would you come up with bringing the knight to h6? I couldn't even think of it. And we're 7 moves in now, and he hasn't moved the king. I mean, it's amazing. It's just amazing. Downright amazing. He might be trying to prevent the black king from coming in the game because of knight f7, g5. There's his king. He found it. Woo! Let's go, Falk. He was afraid I was going to start sounding like Jesse, so he finally played a move. Played an actual chess move. Now, c3, it may be too little too late. c3, king e1, bishop a4. I mean, it's not like looking good for white. It's not looking good for white. Not by any stretch of the imagination. Actually, you could maybe even do better with c3 here. Make that pawn advance, right? Get control of another square for black. And then play here. Oh la la. The knight on h6 is killing him now. c3 brought the king. Okay. That's useful to hear, Stamen. Yeah, that's useful to hear. So bishop a4 comes in to lock the king away. f5 is played for absolutely no reason. No, I mean, I don't know. Falk doesn't really have anything to do here because his knight's on h6. I guess he's hoping for gf5, knight f5, and he could bring his knight back in the game now that the knight's realized the errors of its ways. Black should definitely ignore this. The problem is black didn't find bishop c4 to b3. But okay, I mean, like, they're not supposed to find every great move, right? That would be an unrealistic expectation. So it's not easy for black to figure out how to progress towards a win here. That move I like quite a lot. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, Cartier. Woo! I think that this is what Jesse would call showing him the business. Right? Bishop c2. Whew! And the bishop can come to b1. Bishop can come to b1. It's a real tough position for white, right, folks? Real tough. I mean, if this knight were, where it started, things wouldn't be too bad. Because now this king's closer to the pawn. There's reasonable chances. Yeah, recapture is pretty obvious. Spent some time on it. A little worried about Cartier's clock, but the quality of moves has gotten really nice here. Okay. The knight returns. Yeah. Yeah, the knight is returning. What do you want from the knight? That's exactly what I wanted from the knight. Come back from your stupid vacation. Is it just lost? I don't see a clear win yet, von Igelfeld. The key is for white not to play a3 here. And Falk's got 4 minutes on the clock, so hopefully he's not just going to bash out a3. He needs the pawn on a2 to keep the knight out of b3. So he's got to try king d1, and if bishop a2, king c2. And king d1, c2, king c1. And then you thank goodness for the pawns you didn't move. $1,000 bet that he plays a3. Ooh, that's harsh. That's harsh. He's even thinking about this move. Look, he stopped. He spent almost a minute on it. He's not just going to play a3 and get queened on. Like, Falk can calculate, folks. Falk can calculate. This is pretty direct. Here, threatening to queen. King here, knight check, resigns. No, you lost $1,000. That was a very bad bet. Yeah, now it's not certain that black wants to take on a2, right? The question is, who does von Igelfeld have to give the $1,000 to? To Falk, who didn't play a3? Falk, the player who played enough bad moves to sort of sandbag Igelfeld into making that bet? Like a pool shark? He's got to give it to Falk. Pumpkin adjudicates. Falk will be happy to hear that he's just earned $1,000 with the worst chess to ever earn $1,000 in history. Yeah, not so easy. It's close. It's close. What are we going to get now? Black's bishop is trapped. Hard to move forward. I think so, Pumpkin, yeah. Here comes the king. Cartier's king has been... Right? He tried to win. Couldn't quite do it. Now he needs the king. Bishop. Do you think he's going for maybe bishop d7? To kick the knight and take the c-pawn? Yeah. I think that was a pretty good move from Falk. King f6. We'll find out now if he goes bishop d7. That's what I'm expecting. Bishop d7, knight c5, actually. Oh, it doesn't work at all. It's not that easy to clean this up for white. Even though you've trapped all black's pieces with your king. Do you see how good this king is, by the way? He's like fighting off all three of these. Right? A 3-nation army couldn't hold this king back. He's just fighting them off. Right, so basically knight c5 can be played now. Oh, knight b6? No. Now bishop c6. King e5. Okay. Okay. But knight c5 like had to be right. Knight c5. Because depending where the bishop goes, you can then play knight e4 and redefend the pawn and gain more time for your king to progress, right? You also stop bishop e6. So some move like this, then you come here. It's a long way for white to chase this knight out, right? Bishop d7 to h3 to g2. And then you try and go back to a4 maybe, or by then your king's on d4. So, okay, so in the game, knight b6, bishop e6. Here comes the king! Also possible for black was knight a4, right? But black has the advantage. They don't need to repeat. Knight c5 would have been a little more convincing to me. So here what we're looking at is king takes c3, and then black will take on d5. Probably with the... I would take with the bishop and keep my knight. White can't trade all the pieces because the king pawn ending is lost. So if you take on d5, you expect white to trade one piece and then run away with the other. Oh, actually, after king c3, bishop d5, white can't trade any piece because this is check. So here, check forces the trade, but not only that, but knight d5, check, and the bishop's hanging, so you can't move the king away instead of trading. So on bishop here, white would have to do something like bishop h3. And then you've got like king here. Such a position is really scary for white. Let's see what's happening. Bishop f7. Oh, wow. Targeting something else. Wow. Wow, good little resource there. Good little fight. Falk's got a little bit of fight in him. He's not going to roll over and just give this to Cartier. Not yet. On king f6, bishop e6 repeats. On king to d4. Okay, that's going to be one repetition. On king to d4 is probably good. That's what I didn't get to. You completely abandon this pawn. King d4. Force this piece bad, right? And now let's say the knight goes, I don't know. I mean, it's not going somewhere very good, right? Here. I mean, then, for example, you can take here. Knight b4 is a huge threat, so they have to trade this piece and get this back. Now you've got 3 on 2. Oh, but you can't go king e3. Once they play this, they've got good drawing chances. Let me rethink that. Here is correct. Here, fine. Let's think. Let's think now. We could go bishop d5 and let the opponent take the g pawn and get counterplay. It's not totally clear either. Not an easy calculation. Sorry, we have to keep up with their game. So king f6, bishop e6, king e5, bishop f7. All right, so black can take on d5 or play king d4 here if they want to try to win. Let's quickly calculate a king and pawn ending. Knight d5, bishop d5, bishop g6, bishop e4, bishop e4, king e4, king c3, king f4, king d4, e6, king c4, king g4, king b5, king h4, king c6, d5, king d6, draw. Drawn by repetition. Oh, you got to at least try, my friend. You got to at least try. Oh, yeah, that's what I was just calculating for you, Douglas.
Hello.
All right.
I think that king and pawn ending is just barely a draw, Douglas. Yeah. Okay, welcome back, you two. So you guys want to sort of talk together for a bit on an analysis board for us?
Yeah, sure.
So
Yeah, it is a very annoying endgame.
all right, so I'm going to invite you guys back to this board that I have here. Let's see, people. Oh, you're still on it. You guys still have this board between Vaganyan and Rashkovsky.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I'm going to go here to your games, and I'm going to load up your second game. And I'm going to add it in there. Okay, so now, are you guys able to move through it and talk about it?
Yeah.
All right.
See stuff now.
Take it away.
Yeah, I'm not sure I was so happy with what I got.
In the second game, you mean?
Yeah, in the second game. In the first game, I mean, we can look at it after this, but I was kind of happy with what I got as back. But yeah, this idea of putting the knight on e3 is probably not as good. Like,
Yeah,
I thought it might be nice to put the knight there.
I found it. I mean, I couldn't understand the idea here of knight g4.
I just thought it looked like a nice square for the knight. Like it puts pressure on c4.
Or blocking, yeah, it's attacking c4.
Yeah, I kind of thought I could, like how to put it, like keep the c pawn fixated in a way, right, and then attack it. But it's probably better to first. I mean, if I do something like this, like do this maybe, and then bishop f1 or something. Like,
sorry, like, show us your arms again, Falk. What do you want to do first?
I mean,
e4 and then knight e3, right?
So I'm not sure if it works, but my idea was something like to attack the c4 pawn, and I mean, I'm not sure if now I'm looking at it, I guess differently, but I'm not sure if maybe something like e4 would have worked, and then knight e3 and bishop f1 to attack the pawn. Yeah.
Cool. All right, so I'm just going to make a quick note. You guys are doing something right, not wrong, but I'm still going to make a note of it because it's going to be useful for other people.
Yeah, sure.
The very first thing that they did when they came into this is they're evaluating whether the idea of putting the knight on e3 was a good or bad plan. That's the very first thing they're talking about. And that's good. Like, you want to say, like, here was my idea. Was it good or bad? Do we agree? Do we not agree? Right? So Falk, the first thing he said was, I thought maybe putting the knight on e3 to attack c4 would be good. Now I don't think it's good. Cartier basically agrees, right? It doesn't look good. Falk says, maybe here's a different way to improve the plan. Put the pawn on e4 first and then try this. If they both think that that sounds like an interesting plan, then they already have an idea of what to practice the next time they play the position, right? Like, if either of them thinks that's a really good plan for white, they can try it with the pawn on e4 now, and both of them will know what they're thinking about and what they're trying to do with that idea. That way, they'll get more out of the repeated games compared to if they just played repeated games without ever checking in about stuff. So you guys, hopefully everybody can see how that's an improvement over just playing, how that improves the speed of the learning. Okay, back to you.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, for the white's position, when I had white, I thought this knight c3 was very nicely placed, and I tried to exchange your active knight on e5 with knight f3. And my first move was knight f3. I also thought about e3, but then I didn't like knight b5, trying to exchange the blocker. Yeah, I thought this would be a problem for me, so I started with knight f3, and you didn't exchange, I think, in the first game.
Yeah, I didn't. It's funny, like, I didn't even consider knight b5 there, which now that I see it, it's like really nice. Yeah. So what do you do after knight b5 here?
In the second game, I played this. Yeah. I thought I was queening, but I wasn't.
It just barely didn't work out, I think.
Yeah. So I think knight on c3 is a nice blockader. This pawn is impeding our bishop. This bishop is also in the starting position. This is a very bad bishop. But for example, you are attacking c4, and I had to keep this bishop here for a long time in the second game.
Yeah, I
guess this knight goes to c5 ideally. And in the second game, you didn't push your pass pawn.
Yeah, no, it was kind of. I mean, in the end, it was kind of late. So, I mean, it worked for you in the first game. Yeah, like, you just pushed the pawn, and I don't know. I moved my piece away from the pawn in a way, and you got a lot of pressure that way. But yeah, we can go through this game first, and then we can see.
Yeah.
What happens? So yeah, like, what happens if we go e4? Yes, yeah. You go knight b5 then.
Yeah, probably.
Maybe we can play a4 first, just to take control of the b5.
Yeah, yeah. I was thinking about it. Yeah, a4 first. But for example, after knight c5, then you will have to defend a4. But the knight on c3 is nice where it is. So yeah, a4, starting with a4 is good, I think.
Maybe if you get something like this, and now this might be better.
Yeah, maybe knight c5 is too quick, because how will I defend c4?
Yeah. I'm not sure.
Yeah, but maybe e4 knight e3 is it might be good. But then maybe I can play knight d3.
Maybe you can play h5 first, like as a throw-in. Like if you just to prevent a knight from coming to e3 in time.
Yeah.
Because now this, I guess, is good for black again. because I'm never like this knight is in an outpost in a way, and I can't get rid of it.
Yeah,
Maybe.
Probably yes. I should play maybe immediately h5, but I didn't think about it. I also think about breaking with e6, but I guess it's not because your bishop will open up.
Yeah, I was like, that's what I was looking at in the first game, but I thought I never want to play that because you open up the bishop.
Both didn't play it.
But, by the way, I'll just make a note. Depending on how much people like playing versus talking, as soon as they come up with a concept like they've come up with so far, a plan for white, right? A4, E4, knight E3. As soon as you have something new to try out, it's okay to stop an analysis and to just go play another game. You know what I mean? Like if you want to, like as soon as you've got an idea that you think's really cool and worth investigating, you can just say like, hey, well, let's try that out in a game, right? And you just go off. Like you don't have to stop here, right? I'm just giving people all the advice and guidance I can on how this sparring really works in practice, right? Like once you've got an idea like that, it's a real idea, right? It's fleshed out in a way, and sometimes the best way is then you just go test it, you know. And certainly there will be some players who have more or less appetite for analysis, right? Some people could sit there for 2 hours talking about one, 5 or 10 minute game that they played. But other people, after they've been talking for 3 or 4 minutes, they might start itching like they want to move the pieces, and that can work too, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But yeah, here I don't know. It's kind of like after like h5 in that one line, but yeah.
Yeah, here you played knight e3 without h5.
Yeah. And also without
I thought I will move,
but yeah.
Move the king to the other side, queen side. I mean, I couldn't come up with a plan. I was, of course, thinking about removing the blockading knight. But at the moment...
So what is wrong with that? Like
knight b5, you can play this, I think. And now you can play e4 maybe, if needed, e3, e4.
But wouldn't you have to consider this as like good for black? Like when you see the structure, I don't know. Like, isn't this like
it
you say,
good, but
yeah, like I'm happy as black.
Yeah, it looks passive, right? But
yeah. Oh, like my good pieces are like tied down, and I like black has all the time in a way, right? Like I guess you go here to prevent a4. Maybe this works technically then, like you can take or something. I don't know. I guess you can't really.
Take.
And then now if you push, you just lose a pawn. Okay.
Yeah.
Never mind.
Yeah, these pass pawns against the knights are tricky. You have to be careful all the time. So you played h4.
Yeah, I was also a bit out of ideas.
Yeah, this knight on e3 doesn't have many squares to go.
So my idea was to somehow make f5 available for my knight.
f4, f5, right? Yeah.
Yeah, like, I don't know, like play f4, g4, and f5 or something. Like,
wow.
Just to make the square available for my knight or so. Like, I don't know, so I can trade off. But it didn't really work in the game.
I can finally see into Falk's endgame mind, and it's a crazy, crazy place. I mean, wow. Wow, what he came up with here. So you didn't play h4 because you were like really excited or thought it was important. You did it because you couldn't find much else to do. So
I mean, yeah, I was.
So that means that the idea of bringing your king out was just not even on your list of things to do. It's not that you were excited to play h4. It's that king f1 didn't even occur to you. Like it wasn't even at the bottom of the list. It wasn't on the list.
I'm sure it was somewhere.
And he wants to move this knight because he realizes he's kind of got his e2 pawn stuck. And he wants to be able to apply pressure with bishop f1. But he thinks that if you ever play knight d1, it's terrible because it's passive. So he won't move the knight backwards, even though the endgame works a bit differently than other phases of the game. And actually, knight d1 is perfectly fine if you want to move e3 and e4 and then put the knight back on e3. That's faster than h4, g4, f4, f5, and then asking your opponent to please trade on f5, which they might never do.
That's a good point.
It's like, like twice to 3 times as fast and much more reliable. In this line you played with knight b5, knight d1, you also were very upset about white's position. I think just because you played a retreating move here and you thought the knight's so passive, but really what's happening is you're just trading a pair of knights, right? Whether black takes on c3 or whether you take on b5 and then go here, all that you've done is you've traded the e3 knight for the d4 knight. So this is why Cartier wasn't so pumped about knight b5, because it doesn't break the blockade. It just trades the bad knight on e3 or the slightly awkward knight on e3 for the knight on d4. Nothing for white to regret that I can tell. So
yeah, for sure, it makes a lot of sense when you say it this way.
Yeah, so we can see Falk has some kind of like horror about this knight to d1 kind of move and no interest in bringing the king. So interesting view. So that's what h4, g4, f4 was all about.
Also, it didn't occur to me, right? Like knight d1 didn't. I mean, I was thinking of king f1 at some point, but
yeah,
knight d1 like never occurred to me.
Right. Yeah.
But you also didn't think about this knight b5, right? In the later.
Yeah, I didn't.
Yeah, he didn't really see that idea coming.
Even when I played black, right? Like I didn't consider knight b5 as well. Maybe something about retreating knight moves.
Retreating knights, yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I spent years and years just being surprised when my opponent's knights move because, like, I didn't see where they were going to go to. I mean, just years of being surprised by knight maneuvers from my opponent and also not even seeing my own. And people have to show me after the game, like, why didn't you bring your knight here? Oh, I didn't see my knight could go there. Yeah. So that's half of why I've been studying Averbach's knight endgame book, because I figured it would just help me to see where the knights can move better over time. Okay, so this was really cool, really interesting work you guys did here. I've just given you a little shortcut by giving Falk, one or two ideas of what's going on here. That the knight can retreat, that's okay. That the king can come out, that's really good. And you guys can go practice this more if you want to now or another time. But that's more or less going to conclude our episode of Endgame Sensei for today. Do either of you have any questions for me right now about what's going on with this position or how you would continue practicing from here?
Yeah, how do you evaluate the position, David?
From the very beginning, you mean?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when we started, I had no idea. That's what I said. I had no idea what the evaluation was. And, when you played knight f3, I didn't really know who wanted to trade knights or avoid trading knights either. And I think that's an important question that you guys may or may not have thought about. Like, who wants to trade pieces? Who would be better off in a king and pawn ending or a knight ending? Or are the bishops or knights better? I think those are some interesting questions to ask if you have some time. Obviously, on the first move, you're just supposed to try some ideas and play some moves. But, as you're playing and you're sitting there, you start wondering who wants trades, who doesn't. After looking at this for a bit, as you guys play it, I guess I don't see a very clear advantage for either player yet. But I could name arguments for why white would be better and why black would be better, things that they could be thinking about, right? Mm-hmm. So white's potential advantage would be that they could attack the c4 pawn. It's on white's side of the board, relatively close to white's king.
Yeah, these bishops.
It took you a long time, Falk, but you eventually brought your king to attack this pawn in this game, right? And then suddenly Cartier's win came to a standstill, right? It looked like he was cruising to a win till your king got to the c pawn. So potentially a reason you could claim an advantage for white in this whole position is basically you want to bring your king to c3 and win this pawn. And then you might argue, well, white would like one or two trades to clear up some of the minor pieces so that the king can make its way to this pawn. That said, there are better and worse pieces on the board, right? Like the knight on b8 is bad at first. Cartier improved it. The bishops on a6 and g2 are a little bit bad at first, so the knights are kind of better than the bishops, maybe. But so the argument for white would be basically you can bring your king here, try and win this pawn. Another argument for white would be you've got the outside pass pawn there, so there are certain knight endgames where black would be in trouble. Their knight would struggle with it. An argument for black to be better would be that white's bishop is really like long-term bad, that if black's king comes to c5 and white's king comes to c3, that black has more space in the area that you're fighting in. You can try and push white back. There could also be plans trying to undermine the d5 pawn. Neither of you tried this, but there must be some positions where black could use a plan of f5, preventing e4, or trading off e4 to cut off the d pawn, and then like king f7 to f6 to e5, you know, knight d7 to b6. Like there would be plans where black would try to go after the d5 pawn and fight in the center. And there's another idea you guys referred to, but then both rejected, which is the idea of e6. And you guys said, well, it would let white's bishop out. But potentially if e6 or e5 were played and white felt like they needed to trade on e6 against either of those moves, and you played f takes e6 and then you played d5, the c4 pawn becomes a protected pass pawn. And black gains like very, very strong dominating influence in the center, which can be used to push the opponent's knights off of good squares. So there could also be an interesting plan for black to try and get an advantage in the center, either with e6 or with f5, something like that. So I can see ideas for both players for the moment.
Interesting.
Yeah, I missed that. Yeah, e6 takes. There's d5 later.
Right. The bishop's like open for one moment, right?
Yeah.
Yay, I'm open. And then king f1, d5. Okay, that was fun.
Yeah, true.
Bye-bye, bishop.
Now, I mean, here this plan's probably not working for black. Why? Because white's improving their pieces and black's just moving a bunch of pawns. So your knight's on b8 and then some kind of fight's going to break out, right? Like e4 fighting over d5 and you're like, oops. I can't help. But there may be some position where the plan is relevant. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe one thing, I don't know if you have time, but do you have any like tips for how to deal with the pass pawn like in the first game? Mm-hmm. Like
yep.
With black?
It's your king's job.
So
king e8,
you just
king
walk
d8,
the king over. Okay.
King e8, king d8, king c8.
Okay.
Imagine all the minor pieces were off the board. You would need to keep your king in the box of that a pawn, right? So when he played a4, king e8, you know, a5, king d8. You just have to go.
Okay.
And if it were an open position, then your bishop could do a better job of guarding an outside pass pawn than your king. Mm-hmm. So you might have the bishop guard the a pawn either on the f1 a6 diagonal or the h1 a8 diagonal.
Okay.
However, two problems with that in this position. Number one, those center diagonals are generally blocked. Number two, it's same colored bishops. So if you rely on your bishop and let their pawn go to a7 with nobody else nearby and just your bishop on the long diagonal, and then your opponent offers a bishop trade, you resign.
Yeah, okay.
Your king has to be close enough to recapture the bishop on b7, you know? Or to trade the bishop, and after they recapture, play king b7. So I think in that position, you're more or less obliged to move your king towards the queen side if the opponent pushes the a pawn. Even if they don't, you probably should. But if they push the a pawn, I think, yeah, you're really obliged.
And okay, maybe a last thing now. So in this kind of endgame, when do I decide? Like, when is it time to bring the king in, or when is it time to improve the pieces? That makes sense. Like, that's kind of something I think I struggled with this position.
Definitely.
Was,
I can confirm you struggled with it because you didn't move your king. And the answer was you should have moved your king.
Okay. But
sometimes
I guess it has to be more complete, right? But
yeah. At what time to do it? It's a great question. I've I've been working on like how to understand priorities in endgames, right? Like there's all kinds of different things you want to do. Push your passed pawn, attack their weakness, like activate your bishop, improve your bad knight, bring your king into the center, like take control of an open file. Or you guys may know the idea of like fixing a weakness. Like let's say there's a pawn on h5 and there's light squared bishops. As white, you might want to play a move h4 to keep these pawns on light squares. I don't know if you guys are familiar or not, but that's like another example of like a little move. When is that more or less important than, you know, your king or your pieces? There's no one answer to this. But in general, you want to kind of think of how, first of all, remember that development is still important in the endgame. In almost every endgame, your king's not developed, and sometimes one or two of your pieces are badly placed because they're placed for some kind of middle game stuff that doesn't translate to the end game and they need to be repurposed, right? So very often, right when you get to the end game, there's a phase of like end game development, shall we say, where you need to, let's say you had a rook that was lifted for a checkmating attack or something, like bring it to an open file on the queen side, get it off of g3 or h3, right? Because you're not going to checkmate the king anymore. So you've got this phase where you need to like reposition some pieces, and it's kind of like development. Now, what I am sort of working on is you're kind of wanting to improve your pieces the most per move that you can at the fastest rate, right? So let's say your rook is currently operating as like a 2 and you can turn it into a 5 in one move. That would be 3 points of improvement per move, and you would probably do it because that's a lot. Yeah. Right? But what if it takes 3 moves to do it? Then you say, okay, well, improving the rook from a 2 to a 5 is like 1 point per move. How does that compare to bringing my knight off of b1 to c3, which might add 2 to 3 points in one move, right? So that's what you want to kind of do. You want to improve all the pieces, but often in an order of which piece can you improve the most in the shortest amount of time. So if you look, let's use an example because it's going to be just way too abstract otherwise. If you look at this position, right, or the very starting position, which are pieces that could be improved? I would say everything except knight c3 and knight d4 comes to mind as a piece that could be improved here in the endgame, right?
Okay, so you would like compare, like, let's say this maneuver to...
Hang on. Let's just, I'll take it step by step, a little slowly.
Okay, yeah.
So do you agree that every piece except knight c3 or knight d4 is a candidate for improvement?
Yeah, for sure.
If we were in an opening, you wouldn't say that white was behind in development or hadn't finished development, right? You'd say, okay, white's developed all their pieces, nothing on the back row, king's tucked away, right? Now we're in the end game, suddenly 3 out of 4 pieces are technically in, I would say, sort of in need of development, right? So that's the first interesting point, right? That's a lot of pieces that are kind of badly placed. Now, of these pieces, which can be improved the most, which can be improved the least, which take the most time? So I would say the bishops can be improved the least, because what's making the bishops bad is partly just like a closed pawn structure. In other words, if you could take your bishop off of a6 and put it wherever you want on the board, where would you put it?
c8.
Okay. And how much better would it be on c8?
It would be worse, right? Because it's not defending the pawn.
You're not even sure it's better. So whether or not it would be better is not even obvious, right? So it's not clear that you can improve the bishop much, right? And in theory, if Cartier thinks the bishop is better on c8, maybe it's like better by 0.2 or something like that, right? It's going to be small.
Yeah.
Okay. Sure. How much better could your king be? That's going to be the one that can improve the most out of any of these pieces, right? Because right now your kings are like sort of 0 to 1s, right? And if the black king were on c5 or b4, that's it. You know, like it's like a 4 in fighting. A king can actually be like a 4 in close fighting when it gets to the right area, and you would just be like winning the game. And same thing for white. If you put the white king on c3 or b4, suddenly that's a 4, and white's basically winning. So the piece that can be improved the most is the king.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about the knights. They're in between the kings and the bishops. The knights, you can improve them in 1 or 2 hops. You won't improve them as much as the kings, right? They're not as bad as the kings. And they're not going to be as like crushing, like, you know, knight f3 versus knight h2. I mean, knight f3 is better, but it's not like winning the game, right? And knight d7 is going to be better, and knight c5 is going to be better, but not just breaking the game immediately, right? So you can improve the knights a little bit less than the kings, but quite a bit faster, right? It would take you, what, 5 moves to improve the kings the way I want, and 2 moves to improve the knights?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you have to balance, like, okay, I can improve my knight by like 1 in 2 moves, or my king by 4 in 5 moves. And that might be worth making 1 move of the knight first, right? And then pretty much it's time for the king. Now, this is just a very, very vague theory that I've been working on. I haven't, you know, seen it anywhere else or had anyone else tell me anything about this. It's something I've puzzled about all my life. And it's always going to depend on some little tactics, right? Like sometimes improving a piece allows you to cut off the king, and that makes that really valuable. Like, let's say the white king needs to go through d1 to get into the game, and black could play bishop a4, right? As happened in your first game. Or the second game? Second game. In the second game, right? You guys had this moment where black could play bishop a4. So we get, right? In this position, okay, should black improve the king? Maybe, but with c3 here, bishop a4, you cut off the king, and then you give yourself time to improve your king, right? So like sometimes that would make more sense, right? It's full of tricks and details and everything like that, right? Maybe before you can move your king, you need to protect your h7 pawn against knight f3. Maybe in the starting position, it's good for white to play knight f3 so that if the black king runs to the queen side, you have knight g5. So you know that knight f3, let's say you know that black doesn't want to trade pieces for some reason, and you're thinking like, okay, now if they ever want to play king c7, they have to spend 1 move on h6 or f6. So basically, you got knight f3 for free or whatever, right? Because you see a little tactical detail like that. That stuff's always going to throw wrinkles on it, right? I mean, that would be like in the opening, some move with your queen that wouldn't be a normal move to bring out your queen early, but you see that because you're attacking g7, it's going to make things awkward for your opponent to develop. And so you use the queen, right? So there's going to be all kinds of wrinkles to it, but my guess would be in the starting position, you want 1 or 2 moves for your bad knight, and then a bum rush of your king. That would be my guess. Okay. Of how this endgame should look approximately. But then, you know, you have to calculate details. I mean, I don't know if knight b5 on the very first move for black might be a problem for white, right? I don't know. That has to be looked into. You know, Cartier, one thing Cartier really did well is Cartier understood this knight on c3, how important it was to the position. From both white and black's perspective. You know, he realized how important it was, and that helped him play the whole game quite well strategically.
Yeah. Always tricky end games.
Always tricky. And the other big lesson from these end games was not like specific strategy to the banco, but you guys saw how many little funny tactics there were that you maybe weren't used to. Little moves that surprised you from each opponent, right?
Yeah.
Even
for me.
Even just at the end of this game, Cartier, where you know you were so close to winning the game, and then suddenly he comes up with bishop f7, bishop e6, and it's not obvious how is black supposed to win, right? Just that little trick of like, it looks like he's down a pawn and your king is centralizing and you might win a second pawn on d5, and suddenly like there's no easy way to cover everything there, right? Just those little tricks are cool. So, and there were some really cool tactics in the first game. Throughout, there were little details. So I think that's like a really good lesson to learn. You guys can also check the VOD and see a lot more that I said about your games as far as like move by move and some of the little calculations.
Yeah, we'll do.
All right. Does chat have any important questions about how to do the endgame sparring or anything that we've gone over today?
Chat is sleeping.
What's that?
Chat is sleeping.
Chat is sleeping. Well, I mean, Pumpkin, you're absolutely right that, you know, the understanding is super cool, but the practical play is a whole other component, right? Like you could learn all this stuff about what order to develop your pieces in and how to recognize which knight is good or which you want to trade. And then you get into the game and you just miss some little tactic, right? I mean, it's so easy because they're unusual tactics, sometimes little patterns that we never picked up in like tactics trainers because they don't have as many endgames in them. So it's totally possible to bungle them. And that's why, another reason why you just have to do a lot of playing and not just talking, right? Like talking always feels great. We're like, oh, yeah. Oh, that's so cool. And then like you play a game and you just let your opponent queen a pawn, right? And just like, oops. You know, I mean, even when I was, you know, like a strong master, I would sometimes just like, I'd be thinking about all these complicated things and just let my opponent queen a pawn, you know, like they have a pawn on h6 and they play bishop takes g6 or something, and I can't play hg6 or the pawn queens. And it's like, oops, what was I doing? What was I doing? So, yeah, got to spar a lot because winning or losing the games will often come down to all these little random details and tactics, and you want to build up your skill at all those things too. All right. Well, we will let chat continue their nap and send a raid somewhere.